So let me start and say, in general, when anyone think about drug discovery, is basically you translate your ideas into a medicine to benefit patient. And that actually has been done primarily by pharmaceutical company to the large extent, almost 75–80% of the drug discovered by pharmaceutical company. And then there are collaboration from university and government research institute. And that's very important to know that drug discovery is an integral part of doing biomedical research. This summarizes for you the process involved to discover new drug, whether you discover a drug for cancer, for depression, or for blood pressure or any other disease state. Basically, you really need to understand for any disease what the biomolecule involved in that. And we refer to that as a target. Like I give you example for depression where we are here. Our target are the neurochemicals in the brain. So that's our target. And for us in drug discovery, we have to find molecule which can modulate the target. And these are not drug yet. You go through a lot of process where you refine them to become safe and effective preclinically to take them to human, to develop them. I refer to this when I talk to people who are not working in drug discovery as if your disease is having a lock, and for us to get the key, refine the key until you open the lock. And that's how we refer to drug discovery. Let me say that people may think there are so many drugs. Actually, coming from the US, the drugs are approved by the FDA, and FDA has been in establishment in the early 1950s. Since then, only about 1,600 drugs has been approved by the FDA. And the majority of these drugs, it's like the Effexor, are small molecules, about 80% of these drugs, and about 13–15% are injectable and protein. All these drugs, which was discovered, only work in this limited number of targets. Whether you have cancer or you have CNS disorder, there are not too many targets as people think. But back in the early year 2000, when the human genome was deciphered, and people start asking questions, how many genes we have in our body, you will see conflicting reports. Some say maybe 100,000 genes, some say 50,000 genes. And the acceptable actually now is about 30,000 genes. So as a scientist, I would say, well, that gives me about 5,000 targets. So now those 350 or so, yes, there are 5,000 targets. But the most important things, are these related to disease or not? And that's what we refer to target validation. And that's what most of pharmaceutical companies spend the efforts on validating. And you can say that target causes cancer, that target causes depression. And these are very important process for us. For me in the lab, I don't have to make you just effective drug and safe drug. I have to make sure the drug will go reach the brain. If I make your drug doesn't come to the brain, it's worthless drug. So actually for me, I've been doing a lot of efforts in order to come up with a drug which can reach the target, whether it's the brain or the tumor cell or whatever. So that's what's involved in our work in the laboratory. Our work in the lab is only involved in this part here. You can see it's a limited amount of the R&D or drug discovery and development. You have to go through all this process in order to get drug to patient. You know how much involved in that? We work with thousands, literally 100,000 of molecules. And these molecules die as you go and refine until you come to your drug. So the process is long and is expensive. I'll just share with you quickly for certain reason that in my lab, we are here. And when I started working in Effexor, it cost about $18 to $20 million to do the discovery. But look, multiply by tens until you reach the drug come in the market. So for us, in order for us to be more efficient, if we're going to fail, because many drugs, you put them in human, they don't work. So it's better to fail here because it's cheap. If you fail here, you lost a lot of money. And that's actually what we do in our research to make sure we have the right drug candidate to go for human. Just to give you a summary of the cost, which now we can reach actually close to $2 billion to discover a drug. Basically, you can go buy yourself 2 luxury cruise ship or 3 Airbuses for the price of 1 drug to reach the market. It's a lot of money. That's why we really need to finish with that. But there is another hurdle, the regulatory authority, whether you have FDA in the US or the regulatory in Japan or in any other country. Traditionally, many years ago, usually you get a drug and you do safety and efficacy and against placebo. Once you do that, the drug can reach the patient. That was in the old days. Now it's becoming a lot stricter and the bar is getting taller. You have to do comparator and you have to have your drug better than the comparator in order to go there, and then you have other process. Because in many countries, government set the price, except in the USA. In the USA, the company set the price because actually they spend a lot of money for R&D. So here is you have the pricing, you have the access, and so on. FDA becoming more strict. To discover cancer drug is much easier to approve than discover other drugs. Because cancer, you want to prolong the patient life for 2-3 months to be approved. For example, in the antibacterial, FDA changed the name and the rules in year 2000. When you compare an antibiotic, it's not enough to be good. They have to be 10 times better than. So that's why research slowed down in this area. But as I mentioned, these steps involve whether you do vaccine, small molecule, or protein for areas in cardiovascular, metabolic diseases, inflammation, neuroscience, oncology, or for women health and bone therapy, and that's also involved in our drug discovery process. So let me tell you, this is an example of this platform which we worked on. Of course, Effexor SR is one of them. Then you have for inflammation, Empril, and you have vaccine for Prevnar. But today, gathering, we are all interested in Effexor. So let me actually shift gear and talk about depression. Definitely, depression is one of the debilitating diseases worldwide, and there's large population suffering from depression. And it really varies from one country to another. For example, in US, you get women twice as much as men suffer from depression. If you go into my country, in the Middle East, is different. And you find sometime between married couples actually is less depressed in Western world. It's opposite in the Middle East. So there is a lot of actually factors involved in that. But the prevalence of the disease, actually, as in the US, is comparable more or less here in Japan, and sometimes it's higher in countries like developing world and in India and so on. It's a lot of cost involved in that. So for us, we say that, okay, what the symptoms and sign for depression? And it's really in simplest way, they divide it into two major categories, emotional and physical symptoms. And that's where the clinician, and you know better than I do in this area, and these many depression symptoms come across, and it's known that depression diagnosis, which is clinical depression, is different from any other social or temporary depression. If you lose member in the family or so you become depressed, but that's temporary depression. That's not a clinical depression unless if you follow the DSM-4 and you have persistence of symptoms and so on. Let me say something about the treatment of depression, and I just call it roughly, it's good news. I mean, it's sometimes misconception. People say, you know, people get better without drug. They can get better in few months or in couple years, or they will respond to any antidepressant. In reality, actually, there is actually fewer response, and people don't achieve remission, and actually there are some discontinuation. And I mentioned here from the literature some of the actually percentage associated with and lead sometimes to the non-compliance and withdrawal from using the medication. And of course, that happen is associated with a lot of cost, and that's why some of you related to social symptoms. Of course, when you talk about social and motivation, because these are the impact on the society, and people don't work regularly and so on. Let me here just say a couple words about the response. And I mean, when you look at and you actually all actually well expert in that, when the patients start develop symptoms and you do the scores in the high 20s and they become actually depressed, once you treat them and you try to reach almost 50% of the HAM-D, then you know that you have some response. If you do better and actually you reach 7 or 8 or so, you know that the patient could be symptom-free or asymptomatic, and that's remission. Because what happened actually during treatment, and this is well documented by Effexor in his report, that people normal, when they become depressed, they start developing symptoms and they go into depression, and they need to be actually attended to, and they take antidepressant and they move actually toward response. During doing that, in the first maybe 3 months or so, they can relapse. You need to continue treatment because your ultimate goal is remission and recovery, and then you give maintenance dose after that. That's why you find some antidepressant. Many clinicians, they like to start at lower dose, and then they go higher until they reach actually response or achieve remission. Then they have a maintenance dose associated with therapy. Because if you don't really reach remission, then there are failure of being well-being, and as you mentioned, the social aspect, and all leading to some increased risk of suicide. For me as a scientist, when you ask me, if you come up with new antidepressant, what the clinical goal or what you want to achieve? I'll tell you, most of antidepressant, when they work slowly, take several weeks. So I would like to achieve rapid onset of action. And of course, for a patient who's taking a drug, like an old drug, the tricyclic, imipramine, and so on, and they don't respond well, I want to have a drug which actually can treat broad range of patients. And then in the meantime, I wanted a drug which minimize or no side effect associated with the drug. And that actually lead us to the evolution of antidepressant drug. When you look at the antidepressant drug, started by non-selective, and these actually may or may not actually work on multiple receptors, and we're all familiar with the monoamine oxidase, tricyclic and tetracyclic, and so on. But these are non-selective, and you will eventually have dry mouth or some side effect of that. And then it came the receptor blocker, where you can block certain neuroscience receptor with or without reuptake inhibition, like Remeron. Then, of course, the breakthrough came with the actually selective reuptake. And we saw the evolution in that, where you focus on serotonin, you get the selective reuptake, Prozac and others and so on, or what it happened actually was the first drug, which is SNRI, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake, and that's where you come up with the Effexor, and of course, the regular mood stabilizer and so on, which really not that much being in use. Here in Japan, this is where you can see, despite of the delayed entry, some of the available drugs here in the Japan market, and I list them here, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, the SSRI, and then also the drugs which call them NASSA. These are like Remeron, and now the breakthrough came with drugs like SNRI, Effexor, and so on. There are a lot of other drugs under development or is not pursued. And that's another thing when you do the historical retro actually active study, you find out that the reason the drugs has not really come to the Japanese market is really historical, maybe cultural reason, where the diagnosis and so on in many countries, in my country also, that things where people could be depressed for many years, but they don't want to be diagnosed or known as. Then in evolution in clinical trial, I showed you in the US, where we start with placebo and you go into several bars to do this. Here actually, there was in the beginning no placebo trials and has to be with comparator. Then it's moved in with the inclusion of placebo until actually now the placebo control, and of course following all the international and with the diagnosis DSM-4 and so on. So that actually will speed up the development of drug, where new drugs doesn't take 15, 20 years, and it will be actually eventually marketed faster here. Let me talk about Effexor now. If you're going to treat any mental illness, really what you have here, whether you treat a neuropsychiatric illness or neurodegenerative illness, I listed here some of the neurotransmitters, about 6 of them, were they associated with our function and the mood and the cognitive function. Here they are listed from the dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and so on. So any imbalances of these neurotransmitters will give you a disease state. For example, if you have too much dopamine, you will develop schizophrenia. If you have less serotonin, norepinephrine, you'll be depressed, and so on. So these are actually very important, but let me focus on those 3. And those 3, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, we relate to them, call them the biogenic amine, because all of them have, as a chemist, an amine functionality. So they are biogenic amine. So these actually were playing an important role for your mood, cognitive, and your behavior. And I list them here, those 3 in the 3 corners, and you look at all broad range of behavior and mood, which you can find from that if you have lack of energy or you have, so all these are symptoms of depression. So these actually neurotransmitters play an important part in treatment of neuropsychiatric disorder. Now let's talk about the hypothesis of norepinephrine and serotonin. When they released here in the synaptic cleft, and then they release, so the body can utilize them and function normally. Of course, after they do the function, they go back, and that's what we call reuptake. So what happens if you don't have enough here, people become depressed. And that's actually the first thing when we discover new antidepressant. We try to elevate the level of neurotransmitter. Okay, so you found some researcher, they really like to work in serotonin. And I listed here some of the drug evolved, and with the asterisks, those are not being approved here. But some drugs focus only on serotonin, and you get the Paxil, the Zoloft, and other. and some drugs only on norepinephrine. So when we were working on that project, we figured if people work on one or another, why don't we work on both? And the concept here of working on both, we said that might help to get rapid onset of action and you treat broad range of patients. And that's how the idea about the discovery of venlafaxine or Effexor came from. And we were pleased to see that Effexor indeed blocked the reuptake here in terms of norepinephrine and blocked the reuptake of serotonin, so you have more available for patient treatment. That was the concept. We were pleased when we look at the Effexor or venlafaxine attributes. We realized that when you block the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, it doesn't do anything else. So it does not bind to cholinergic receptor or histaminergic receptors. And that's important, unlike the tricyclic, because you will get the side effect from having non-selective. So there is tremendous selectivity here with Effexor. We found it's actually well absorbed and tolerated, and when it's metabolized in the liver, like any other drug, it actually metabolized mainly into another active antidepressant, which is called ODV, or O-desmethylvenlafaxine. So we were actually pleased with Effexor, and when we took that actually in the animals, and here I show experiment with the rat brain where you actually do microdialysis, and we treat with venlafaxine, and we do treatment acute, and we do chronic, and look what happened when you do chronic. You get tremendous increase in serotonin and norepinephrine. So we actually were pleased with the discovery of venlafaxine, which is Effexor, and was convenient, actually sustained release, like the one here, the SR, or we call it extended release. And that actually worked in broad range of actually patient. And I want to emphasize broad range, because if you look at the venlafaxine, at lower dose, which actually more effective on serotonin, and then at higher dose, you bring in the norepinephrine. So that means if people working in SSRI and not respond well, moving those patients into norepinephrine for component plus the serotonin, and that's what happened. And I noticed this actually, many of the patients with Dr. Okasha, who's leading actually psychiatrist in the Middle East, he was switching patient into actually venlafaxine from the SSRI. And of course, since we marketed this many years ago, I mean, there is a lot of wealth of literature from having almost 20 patients or so been treated by this drug. Let me try to just bring you here in the simplest thing to show you. This is, as a chemist, this is the structure. So when you take Effexor or venlafaxine, that's what patients take. And I highlight here the box here. When metabolized, that box became this box. So you're losing certain group, and that's why we call it the ODV. But to our pleasant surprise, we found that ODV, which is actually 56% in the metabolism, in its own have serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibition. So imagine the patient when you take venlafaxine and you titrate the patient and so on, the patient actually will have another antidepressant which is coming inside their body, which is actually O-desmethylvenlafaxine. So that's active metabolite in itself. Make Effexor is an active antidepressant, and the metabolite is an active antidepressant. Let me close by summarizing. I hope I shared with you how we discover drugs in a simplistic term and how the commitment to innovation that we reach to get the drug to the target. But we actually were gratified by having the first SNRI approved by the FDA. And that actually led many other companies to follow that route. They were focusing on serotonin. So they went back into their lab after Effexor came to the market. And of course, we know that there are Cymbalta, there are Savella, and there are other Fatsima. But when you look actually on the practitioner side and how the Effexor are well tolerated and actually broad range of patients. So that was actually tremendous success. So it's, in addition to being the first SNRI, it's first-line therapy for MDD and for refractory patient and non-responder from other drugs. And of course, I shared with you that millions of patients benefited from venlafaxine. That's actually was the guidance for other company, where people look what's available and they see actually first SNRI, then everybody will try to come up with another venlafaxine lookalike. And that's actually was the contribution we did actually for drug discovery and to the patient. Thank you very much, and I will be ready to answer any question.